Late at night, the subway becomes a hunting ground for a ruthless killer. With no witnesses and no apparent motive, NYPD races against time to catch a predator who strikes in total silence and leaves nothing behind but bodies. New York City in the mid-90s was a city in transition. Crime had been at an all-time high in the late 80s and early 90s, but the NYPD was fighting back. The new policies CompStat, broken windows policing were making an impact. Murder rates were dropping, crack was no longer king, and Times Square, once a seedy haven of crime and vice, was being sterilized into a tourist attraction. Even with crime down, the underground tunnels remained a world of their own. Every New Yorker knew the unspoken rules: don't make eye contact, keep your bag close, and if a train car is mysteriously empty during rush hour, there's a damn good reason. The subway wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a battleground, a space shared by millions, and sometimes it became a hunting ground. I was a few years into the job, still considered a young guy in the squad. I had my first collar, had roughed up my share of perps, but I wasn't seasoned yet. This was the case that changed that. When the first call came in, I had no reason to think it was anything out of the ordinary. At that time of night, the J train wasn't exactly the safest place to be. It ran through parts of the city where you didn't linger if you could help it. I pulled up to the station, flashing my badge to the transit cop standing at the top of the stairs. "Where's the body?" I asked. He jerked his thumb downward. "Last car. Kid looks young." I made my way down, boots echoing in the empty station. The platform smelled of stale piss and hot metal. As I reached the end of the train, I saw them, two officers, standing next to a row of seats. And in the middle of them, slumped over like he had just fallen asleep, was a young man. His throat was a clean, straight gash, just under the chin. There was no struggle, no defensive wounds, just a pool of blood beneath him, already congealing against the grimy subway floor. One of the uniforms, a guy named Torres, handed me a wallet. "Name's Kevin Cho, NYU student. No cash, no phone. Just his ID and a Metro card." I studied the kid's face, frozen, peaceful even. If not for the blood, he could have been mistaken for any other exhausted college kid riding home late. I looked around the train car. "Anyone see anything?" Torres shook his head. "That's the thing. No one heard a damn thing." I frowned. The subway was never silent. Even in the dead of night, there was always something, a drunk muttering to himself, an argument between strangers, the distant sound of a saxophone echoing down the tunnels. How does someone slit a guy's throat in a subway car and nobody hears it? I muttered. No one had an answer. We pulled the few people who had been in the car for questioning, but they were as clueless as we were. One woman had her headphones in. Another guy had been half asleep. A third said he got off just before Essex and hadn't seen anything suspicious. The crime scene unit came in and did their thing. No footprints, no fingerprints on the grab bars, nothing that shouldn't have already been there. A single drop of blood was found near the exit doors, suggesting the killer had calmly walked out at the next stop. No chaos, no panic, just precision. Back at the precinct, I sat across from my partner, Detective Russo, who had a few more years on me but wasn't quite grizzled yet. We went over the case notes, trying to piece together some kind of picture. "He didn't take his wallet," Russo said, flipping through his notepad. "Didn't take anything, just slit his throat and left." I nodded. Then why kill him at all? That was the million-dollar question. If this was a robbery, it made no sense. And if it wasn't a robbery, then it was something worse. 3 days later, another call came in. Same train line, same MO this time. It was a middle-aged man, a sanitation worker named Luis Ortega, found slumped against the door at Myrtle Avenue Station. His throat had been cut with surgical precision. The similarities were immediate and undeniable. Same time of night, same method, same eerie silence. "This ain't random," Russo said grimly as we stood over the second victim. The medical examiner confirmed what we already suspected: both wounds were nearly identical. Same depth, same clean stroke. The angle suggested the killer was facing the victim directly, close enough to smell his breath. "This guy knows what he's doing," I muttered. Russo crossed his arms. "Or he's done it before." By the time the third murder happened a week later, a woman, early 40s, found at Marcy Avenue. The newspapers had picked up on the pattern. The New York Post ran the first headline: "Subway Slasher Stalks the City." That was it. The name stuck. It became the talk of every news channel. The mayor went on TV, promising swift justice. The NYPD set up a task force, and the department brass wanted results yesterday. But we had nothing. No footage. No prints. No suspects. All we knew was that somebody was hunting people in the subway, and the city was running scared. We dug into the victims' backgrounds, looking for any connections. There weren't any. Kevin Cho, NYU student, studied engineering. No record, no known enemies. Luis Ortega, father of 2, worked for the sanitation department for 15 years. The third victim, Maria Vasquez, worked nights at a bakery in Queens. Different ethnicities, different neighborhoods, different jobs. No robbery, no sexual assault, no gang involvement. There was no pattern except for the method of the killings. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about money. It wasn't personal. It wasn't even about the victims themselves. This was about the act. Somebody was killing for the sake of killing. And if we didn't stop them soon, they weren't going to stop. For the next few nights, every cop in the city was on edge. Transit cops patrolled every station in pairs. Undercover officers rode the J train at night. We were waiting for him to strike again. The newspapers kept the pressure on. The public was terrified. People changed their routines, avoided the last cars, started carrying knives, screwdrivers, anything they could use to protect themselves. Then, on a cold Wednesday night just past midnight, it happened again. But this time we got lucky. This time the victim survived. She didn't remember falling asleep. That's what she told me later, in a voice hoarse from the wound at her throat. Maria Alvarez was a bartender, working the late shift at a spot in Lower Manhattan. By the time she clocked out and caught the J train, it was past 1 a.m. The train was nearly empty, just a few stragglers, heads bowed, minds elsewhere. She sat near the end of the car, propped against the window. She wasn't drunk, but she was tired. The kind of exhaustion that makes your eyes heavy, your body sink into the seat. The last thing she remembered was feeling cold, then pain. A white-hot slice at her throat. A wetness, her own blood. The panic hit before the realization. She opened her eyes, and he was there. A hood, a coat, a pale, scarred hand gripping a razor. Instinct took over. She lunged forward, sending herself sprawling onto the floor of the train. The movement saved her life. The blade had missed its mark, slicing deep but not deep enough. The doors slid open at Essex Street. She ran, stumbling, gasping, pressing her hand to her throat. She collapsed on the platform. The last thing she saw before everything went black was him stepping off the train behind her. And then, he walked away. I got the call as soon as she was admitted. Russo and I rushed to Bellevue, where she was lying in a hospital bed. For in her arm, bandages wrapped tight around her throat. The cut had missed her carotid by a hair. A few millimeters to the right, and she'd be in the morgue instead of this bed. Her eyes flicked up as I stepped inside. "Maria," I said, sitting at the edge of her bed. "I'm Detective Callahan. This is my partner, Detective Russo. We need to ask you some questions." She nodded weakly. Russo handed her a small pad and pen, knowing her voice was barely there. She wrote 2 words. "I saw him. We finally had an eyewitness. The first and only person to see the subway slasher and live to talk about it." I leaned forward. "We need every detail you remember." Her hand trembled as she wrote. "Hooded coat, dark color, Big pockets. Pale hands. Scar on the right wrist. I frowned. Scar. She nodded, drawing a thin line across her wrist with her finger. Russo and I exchanged a look. That was something. What about his face? I pressed. She hesitated, then shook her head. Didn't see. Shadows. The hood. I exhaled. It wasn't much, but it was more than we had before. Then she wrote something else. He walked away. I read the words twice. He didn't run? She shook her head. That sent a chill down my spine. A killer who didn't run? A man who had just slit a woman's throat and casually walked away? That wasn't impulse. That wasn't fear. That was control. With Maria's description in hand, we started combing through records. The scar on the wrist that stuck out to me. Scars tell stories. They come from accidents, violence, survival. I pulled up assault records from the past 5 years involving bladed weapons. And there it was. Arthur Menendez. Homeless. History of mental illness. Prior arrests for subway-related assaults, including one where he had threatened a passenger with a razor. The arresting officer's notes mentioned a detail. Suspect has a deep scar along his right wrist. The problem with tracking a man like Menendez, he was a ghost. Homeless, no known address, no credit cards, no way to track his movements. He existed in the underbelly of the city, the shelters, the tunnels, the places where people stopped looking. We started searching the stations. Talking to the people most ignored: street vendors, late-night janitors, homeless men and women who knew the underground better than we ever could. And finally, we got a hit that a man at Chambers Street Station told us about a pale guy who sometimes slept in an abandoned subway tunnel near City Hall. Why now? We knew he'd strike again. It was only a matter of when. So we set a trap. Plainclothes officers on every J train after midnight. Eyes on every empty car, every late-night passenger dozing off in their seats. And then, just past midnight on a cold Wednesday morning, I saw him, sitting at the far end of the platform at Canal Street. Rocking slightly, hands in his lap, heavy coat. Right hand curled tight. The scar. It was him. I moved in slow. My heart was hammering, but my hands were steady. Arthur Menendez? His eyes flicked up. He knew. He ran. The second his eyes locked onto mine, I saw it. Recognition. Panic. Fight or flight. Arthur Menendez chose flight. He bolted down the platform, shoving past a stunned passenger, nearly sending them onto the tracks. I was already moving. Police! Stop! I yelled, but I knew he wouldn't. Menendez took off, heading toward the turnstiles, his coat flaring behind him, his right hand still clenched tight. My partner, Russo, was on the other side of the platform, already cutting toward the stairs. We had the exits blocked. He had nowhere to go. But he knew the subway better than we did. Instead of running toward the exits, he leapt over the turnstiles and sprinted straight for the service tunnel. Shit, this was going to get messy. I jumped the turnstile and followed, my boots pounding against the concrete. Russo was half a step behind me, cursing under his breath. The tunnel was narrow, damp, lined with old graffiti and scattered trash. The deeper we ran, the darker it got, the walls pressing in, the stench of mildew and piss thick in the air. My pulse hammered in my ears. Menendez was fast, but fear makes you faster. He darted to the left, slipping through an opening in the rusted chain-link fence, heading into an abandoned subway station. I lunged forward, grabbed at his coat, missed by inches. The bastard was quick, twisting out of my reach, then he was gone. I slowed, gun drawn. Russo was right behind me, flashlight sweeping the space. Where the hell is he? He muttered. The place was massive and old, abandoned station beneath City Hall, a relic from the early 1900s. Curved archways, tiled ceilings, a ghost of a past New York. And now? Now it was a hiding place for something much darker. We moved carefully, scanning every shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a faint scraping sound that I tensed. You hear that? Russo nodded, gun raised. Then a whisper. faint, raspy, coming from the far end of the station. "Had to do it," a voice muttered. I turned fast, flashlight beam landing on him. Arthur Menendez stood at the edge of the platform, hunched, shoulders trembling. His right hand lifted holding the straight razor, the same blade that had sliced open 3 throats. His pale fingers flexed around it, and then he smiled. "I had to," he whispered again. His voice was eerily calm, like he was explaining something simple that I kept my gun trained on him. "Drop the blade, Arthur." His head tilted slightly, eyes flicking between me and Russo. "You don't understand," he murmured. That I took a step forward. "Careful. Slow. I want to, but I can't," he said. His fingers tightened around the razor. Russo shifted beside me. "Don't make us do this, Arthur." He exhaled shakily, like he was considering it, and then, in a blur, he moved straight toward me that I barely had a second to react. He came at me fast, blade raised that I sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, twisted. He howled in pain as I slammed him hard against the tiled wall. The razor clattered to the floor. Russo was on him in an instant, grabbing his other arm, wrenching it behind his back. Menendez fought like a wild animal, kicking, twisting, screaming. But we had him. Russo forced him to the ground, knee to his back. "Stay down." Menendez let out a guttural snarl, thrashing beneath us. "I had to do it. I had to. You don't understand." I pulled out my cuffs, breathing hard. "Understand what, Arthur?" His chest heaved. His body finally went still. And then, in the dim glow of my flashlight, I saw the look in his eyes. Not anger, not regret, relief. That I clicked the cuffs into place, pressing his wrists together. He didn't resist anymore. That didn't say another word. That he just closed his eyes. That as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Russo exhaled sharply. "Jesus." I stood, rubbing the sweat off my forehead. The city had been holding its breath for weeks, and now it was over. Menendez didn't say a word as we dragged him up the subway steps. His body had gone slack after the struggle, like the fight had drained out of him the second the cuffs clicked shut. His breathing slowed. He moved when we pulled him, but it was mechanical, as if he was just a passenger in his own body. The transit cops at the station gave us nods, relief clear in their eyes. Everyone in the department had been on edge over this case, and now we had him. The subway slasher was in custody, but I wasn't celebrating yet. Because the job wasn't done. That I still needed to hear him say it. That I needed to know why. Russo and I sat across from him, the dim glow of the overhead lamp casting shadows over his face. His hood was off now, revealing gaunt cheekbones, sunken eyes, and weeks of unwashed grime clinging to his skin. His wrists were shackled to the table, but he didn't try to move. He barely blinked. We had picked up his file from records. He had been in and out of Bellevue's psychiatric unit for years, diagnosed schizophrenic, violent tendencies, paranoia. But here's the thing. A lot of mentally ill people struggle every day. A lot of them don't kill people. Arthur Menendez had made a choice, and I needed to understand what that choice was. I leaned forward. "Arthur, we know it was you. We got the witnesses. We got the razor. It's over." His lips barely parted. "You don't understand," he murmured. Russo scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "So help us understand." Menendez exhaled slowly. His gaze shifted to me, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The voices told me I had to do it. I kept my face neutral, but inside, something twisted in my gut. Was what I expected. But hearing it still made my skin crawl. "The voices," I repeated. "What did they say?" His fingers twitched slightly against the table. "That they were unworthy," he muttered. "That I had to cleanse them." Russo gave me a look, the kind that said, "This guy is completely gone." I ignored him. "Who was unworthy, Arthur?" I asked. His hollow eyes flicked up at me, and he smiled. "Everyone." For the next hour, we let him talk. Menendez explained his ritual, how he chose people at random, based on a feeling. How the voices whispered when he was on the train, pointing them out. How he had been riding the subways for months, waiting, listening. How the first kill had been an experiment. How the silence had felt so good. I knew I had to do it again. He murmured. The hairs on my arms stood up. Russo exhaled sharply. So that's it? You just cut their throats because some voices in your head told you to? Menendez cocked his head slightly. They didn't tell me how. I stiffened. What do you mean? He blinked slowly. The razor. That was my choice. I swallowed. He had wanted it to be intimate. He had wanted to feel their last breaths. Menendez had been living underground for years. His home was a hidden alcove in one of the abandoned subway tunnels near Chambers Street. That's where we found his things: a tattered sleeping bag, a few scraps of food, and a box. Inside the box, Metro cards, dozens of them, from each of his victims. Like trophies. That's when it hit me. The voices didn't make him do it. They might have pushed him, but Arthur Menendez liked it. Menendez never stood trial. The psychiatric evaluation confirmed what we already knew: paranoid schizophrenia, unfit for prosecution. The courts ordered him to a maximum security psychiatric hospital upstate. Locked away. Forgotten. But me, I couldn't forget. Because no matter how many times I replayed it in my head, I kept coming back to one thing. The look in his eyes when I caught him. Not fear. Not regret. Relief, like he had wanted to be stopped. Like he knew the voices wouldn't stop until someone did. And for the rest of my career, I wondered, how many more are out there, waiting for someone to stop them?